Good afternoon. We're so glad you could come. We've been excitedly and enthusiastically researching what it means to have better housing for everyone and affordable for all walks of life. And I'm Carol Engelhardt, Faith and Justice Chair, and I have Contessa Johnson helping me with the emceeing and introducing speakers. But I wanted to tell you first, there are email papers going around, and it's really important that you sign up for that with your email and your phone number, because what we will do is next steps. So what can we do? How do you find out what Michael Griffin, Samaritan's Closet, let's get the name right, and St. Olaf Church is doing? What is Interfaith Beacon Housing doing? What is Alliance, Whittier Neighborhood Association, doing with Alliance Housing? We couldn't get that speaker to come because our own Stephanie Brown is out of the city right now, but we'll link it in. If you email, we'll tell you those things. So before I hand it over to Contessa, I was going to tell you just for 2 minutes why I care so much about this issue. Last fall, I was a long-term sub at City View Elementary. Does anybody know where that school is? Yeah, it's by, you do because you're the administrator. It's right by that bridge. It's right over into North. The school was frequently on shutdown because of gun violence in the neighborhood. And the kids that stayed in my office all day long were homeless and highly mobile. They were sleeping on an auntie's floor or a grandmother's place. They didn't feel safe when they were sleeping. So one girl in particular was in 5th grade, and every day I was there, she'd come into the office and go to sleep so hard, and I could not wake her up. Now, she should have been in the class, right, learning? But I thought she felt safe with me, and she could get some sleep. So that's when I started looking into this, and then the families that got the stable home, stable schools, those mothers were so happy, and the kids came in joyous, and they felt like they participated in school. They weren't coming down to the health office anymore. So that began my journey, because I have a confession to make. I have only lived 8 years of my life in rental, including dormitory. So when I started looking at this, I was just sobered by the fact that I've never had to deal with affordable housing myself or rental. So that's why I'm doing it, and that's why we have these great speakers. And I'll let Contessa take over. I'm so glad she's my co-host.
Thank you. Welcome on behalf of Faith and Justice Committee. Welcome to our luncheon. Someone just asked me, how did this happen? What is Faith and Justice? We're a committee at Calvary that kind of tries to integrate congregational life with matters of justice in our own community. So I love seeing everyone getting involved, and for all diverse reasons. So it's really the mission of our committee kind of manifesting here in this room. So it's amazing. When Carol contacted me to say I'm digging in deep with affordable housing, some of the first things you told me were, I've heard this, I have no idea if it's true, right? And so we kind of started to talk about, where do we go? What do we do for good information? And my very first job in human services was at a shelter for mothers with children. And so I'd kind of been, which now is 10 years ago, which kind of ages me. But so I was kind of familiar with some things in the city and let Carol know, hey, some things have probably changed. Some policies have changed. And that's kind of what we're here to do, is kind of learn even how they're changing right now and will be changing. But something that also really helped guide our research is Handbook of the Streets. And this was familiar to me in my work in the shelter. One of these comes out, a brand new one, every single year, because resources are always changing. And these are always in print, and they always have the year on them, so you know if you're looking at up-to-date information or not. And they're filled with information that would be helpful to somebody with insecure housing, or just facing any sort of concern that poverty brings about. There's a section on food, shelter, public assistance, healthcare, mental health, immigration. So we have a whole box up here. If this is helpful to you or a location that you travel, I put one in the waiting room of my counseling clinic. Feel free, they're here for you. So, yeah. There's childcare until 1:30. We've heard that over and over. Amy's upstairs. We also wanted to say if you need to get your kid at 1:30 and bring them back down here, that's okay. You're allowed to do that. All right. So our first speaker, who's one first? Yeah. Okay, so you've got Chris and Michael. Chris is a congregant here at Calvary. We're so lucky that he agreed to come and speak. Carol and I were so privileged to sit down with him and hear just your wealth of information about how this looks like specific to Minnesota and the county. So yeah, we're going to welcome Chris to come and share what... Go second, okay. Michael Griffin is here with us from St. Olaf's, and he was sharing, a lifetime. He said he began working in a parish in high school, so this has been a lifetime walk for him, serving out his faith, and now he's the director of social ministry for St. Olaf. So he'll come and talk to us about their work. Thanks, Michael.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to gather with you. And we were chatting a little bit about St. Olaf, and I driven by this congregation many times, and I was always struck by recently with 140 years is a remarkable legacy, and we're only 82 years downtown at St. Olaf, and feel like a little kid now when I gather with such a mature elder and the experience of that. But it's really across that denominational spectrum that we have a common grounding of dwelling. However long we've been dwelling in a community, whether 140 years or 82 years or new to a community or been a part of a community a long time, that common grounding of dwelling is something that motivated our community early on to respond to the lack of dwelling or dwelling place that many of the folks coming to our doors experience. So our outreach ministry has moved over the times depending on who was coming to the door and what their needs were, but for a long time it has dealt with housing. And a little more than 30, maybe about 35 years ago, if you know where we are in the corner of 8th Street and 2nd Avenue is where our congregation is located. There was a building next door it's a 9-story kind of orangish brick building, and it had been built in the late 40s, early 50s. Actually, there was one even before that was built in early 1900s that had been a residence for single women who were working downtown, and it was single rooms with a shared bathroom, some security on the main floor. But it was affordable. It was a sense of community, and it helped people that needed affordable place to live while they were also gainfully employed in the downtown area. And eventually, it was not needed for that purpose any longer, and so our then pastor had an eye on it being next door and was able to talk to the community about purchasing the building. And he did, and he signed that purchase agreement on the last day he was at St. Olaf before he retired. And then with that signed purchase agreement, he turned to his successor, who was starting the next day, and they already knew each other, and said to Brother John Ferlitti, who was the new pastor, well, maybe talk to Catholic Charities and figure out what to do with this. But it seemed like a good deal at the time. It was a great deal at the time, because shortly after that, St. Olaf entered into a partnership with Catholic Charities to provide transitional housing for folks in that residence. And while the specific needs of those who were there for housing have changed somewhat over the decades, what became clear was it was immediately meeting a very critical need for a dwelling place, and served masterfully, and became a relationship also for members of the community to be able to be in relationship with at what was then called the Exodus residents, to connect, to support, to grow, and to learn, because it was also built out of a sense of mutuality that said those that we serve have something to offer the established community as well, and that we are incomplete without that. And that sense of mutuality continues for us this day. The Exodus residents in its most recent years served those with health supportive housing. So while people needed to be able to basically take care of themselves and be ambulatory enough to move, it also had on-site nursing and provided support for those that maybe had been discharged from a hospital, didn't need to go to a nursing home, but did need some follow-up care, and it became a place for that. Well then, as happens with older buildings, it needed some TLC. And TLC of that kind cost a lot of green TLC. And we didn't have a lot of capital money, and Catholic Charities didn't have a lot of capital money. As we sorted out what we might be able to do, Catholic Charities decided to go a different direction, and then they recently opened the Endeavors program on Elliott Park. They purchased and renovated the former Augustana Care Center and renovated it now to transitional housing and supportive housing on Elliott Park. And so they were in our building until that was ready to go with that renovation. And we, in the meantime, have entered into a partnership with Aon to rehab our building. The bones are good, but it needs some major rehab. And Ann is in the business of doing just that. And so we've entered into a long-term lease arrangement with them, 99 years. So we all look forward to when that lease is up and being able to gather on that day. But to be able to rehab the building and provide intensive, supportive transitional housing with intensive support services. And we're kind of in the final stretch. They are working on the final stretch of the financing to go with that. And so hopefully a year from now, you'll drive by and see construction fences and things ready to go. But just a little side tangent with that. It's a reminder of why providing, like the call to provide affordable housing is so difficult. It takes a lot of work. Now, if we were looking to put luxury condos in that building next door, we could put together a quick business plan that would show what would work over the course of the life of any money that was being borrowed for development. And most likely we'd find a capable financer or banker or someone that would say, here's your check, your plan looks good, and it's done. The administration of that exchange is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. But to find enough buckets of funding for a project like this takes so many little buckets to be able to fill up a bigger bucket. And then you take that bigger bucket and pour it into something larger. And then you take those larger buckets and pour it into something that's trying to provide housing for 60 to 80 people. And wow, it's exhausting just thinking about it. So imagine not having the housing that you're even trying to get in there, how exhausting that is and that can be. And one of the things that needs to happen if we're really to provide enough affordable housing across our community is that we need things streamlined so that the cost of administration can be much simpler and much, much less, so that we can provide greater support to those who need affordable housing across all income levels along the way. But fortunately, things are finally moving. It had some bumps with COVID. It had some other bumps with some other financing, but finally we are looking good, and hopefully, like I said, we will be in construction. But the second part of that project was our community said, what are the other ways that we might be able to do something in regard to housing? We started with a modest little building or a rehab. We didn't want to go backwards. We had 90 some units in there. We didn't want to go backwards from there. But as we partnered with Ann around that, we started imagining building above our parking lot. You've been to our campus. It's a kind of typical downtown campus. It's pretty small piece of asphalt for parking, then the building, and then we have the Exodus next door. So there's not a lot of room. As a urban congregation, you can appreciate what that means when you don't have a lot of room to be able to do some things. Some of our suburban sisters and brothers have miles of asphalt and then even some extra green space on top of that. Room isn't the same thing. But we started imagining being able to put some housing above that so we could still have parking for our ministries and our visitors and that sort of thing. And it was like, yeah, we could put maybe a 5 or 6 story building above our parking lot, return the lot when the construction was done, and provide some housing. Well, it was almost like the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, because we kept adding some water to it, and that housing kept growing. And our vision now, phase 2 of our project after the Exodus is rehabbed, is to put a tower above our parking lot of somewhere between 25 and 29 stories. And to be able to provide a spectrum of affordable housing in that tower. And then we're like, well, that works. Maybe if we pull a little more water over here, let's see what happens. And the fullness of our vision is there's a small parking lot next to the Exodus building that's being rehabbed that is also hoped to have a second tower of 25 to 29 stories to be able to provide affordable housing and workforce housing there as well. So when we are done, our hope is that we have north of 500 units of affordable housing across the workforce spectrum when we get done. But to be able to pull all that together is you also need a lot of patience and some humility. And thankfully, we're all in the business though where the act and the power of prayer can help that, because we need that as well to be able to make our own conviction strong and our own patience real and our own ability to make a difference, something that can be realized for the sake of those that we seek and are in relationship with, to have a dwelling place that is meaningful and personal and something that can be connected to the wider community. But to get to that place, we also have recognized some of the entry realities in our daily door ministry as folks come rightfully looking at a faith community to say, can you help me? I mean, and sometimes people say, wow, that really happens? It has to happen. We look around our world where the faith community has failed to respond to people at the door. And, that even goes back to the scriptures where it was like Jesus said, you give them something to eat. And it's something that we are both comforted by the legacy we've had before us and challenged to continue to deepen that legacy to meet the needs who come to our door. And overwhelmingly, over many, many years, have been folks who are unhoused and who need some just very basic needs, starting with a connection and some hospitality. So a lot of our ministry is about just that, of being able to provide a place out of the elements. And in good old Minnesota, we have from hot to cold. And boy, no guess what season we're in right now, all of a sudden. But to be able to provide some respite out of the elements, a place to maybe charge the phone, a place to use the bathroom. I mean, the very basic needs that if it goes unmet, we don't really want to think about it. But too often it does, and especially since COVID, some of the other options since COVID have gotten much smaller than they are right now. But also being able to provide a connection around clothing. We have a large clothing closet for adults, and we probably see 150 folks a week. The majority come for clothing or household goods. If someone does land their own housing, we have basic household goods as well that we transform donations into opportunity to help get the basics into a new place. So that's an important part of our outreach and ministry, in addition to food and respite and hospitality. And then also some resource and referral. If folks need other connections, maybe an application fee, maybe a car repair, some of those kinds of things that help keep the path a little smoother so that people can continue to go forward. And that's been an important part. And then for the last 7 years, we've been in a partnership with Simpson Housing that has been staffing the Adult Shelter Connect. They are in contract with Hennepin County, and it's a collaboration of all the shelter providers in Minneapolis and Hennepin County to provide a connection that's been called the Adult Shelter Connect. And it's a place where someone who does not have housing can access a reservation in the shelter system in Minneapolis. And in days gone by, before this was provided, many of you may know, someone needed to go from shelter to shelter in order to see if there was any room, if there was any place to dwell. And it was certainly possible, even likely at some times of the day and sometimes of the year, where you could go to each of the shelters and none of them would have any room. And the shelter providers and others collaborated and said, we need to do better than this. And so the Adult Shelter Connect was born. And it now, in real time, all the shelter providers are connected, can know what's available in terms of shelter space. So it's a place where folks can come, make a reservation for a space for that night, and know what's available. And then they are also given a community card ID with their picture, their name, the date of birth, and a barcode. And when they get to the shelter, they swipe that code, and then the system knows that that space has now been claimed. And if after a certain hour those spaces are not claimed, someone made other plans or didn't get back, then the system can know there's some space available. So in the evening, someone can call in and then be sent to fill a space. So not only does it maximize the use, but someone that in the past wouldn't have been able to find a place to dwell now has a place to dwell. And so that system has assisted far too many people, but indeed they've been assisted. Where many now are able to call in for that reservation, because once they've been through an intake, then folks are able to make that reservation over the phone. And then when they leave in the morning, they're able to swipe their card and make that reservation for the night. So you don't have to keep going round and round to make that work. So it's been one of the ways to better know how many are needed each night, how many are turned away if things are full, and to help provide some continuing data for how best to respond to those who are in the crisis and the tragic condition of being unhoused. And so that site has been at St. Olaf now for 7 years, and so those folks coming for Shelter Connect are also to connect with our services and the other way around, again, to provide hopefully a seamless way to get people what they need most basically, or at least to recognize and to be able to call someone by name and to have their human dignity recognized and lifted up in a moment when too often that isn't the case for folks along the way. And so that's just a little snapshot of what's been going on at St. Olaf and some of the spectrum needs from someone who all of a sudden on a given day realizes that they don't have housing anymore and try and meet that person where they are, to a longer term vision to respond to these daily realities, to providing hundreds of units of housing and to support that effort along the way. So I don't know if we're going to do questions later or what the... Okay. Any yeah. Simpson Housing? Yeah, Simpson actually is, so some of you know, they provide a variety of shelters or variety of housing services, including a shelter. And a couple years ago, their shelter was located at 28th and 1st Avenue at Simpson United Methodist Church, who initially founded Simpson Housing. And then it's a building that, like happens to buildings that have been around a while, needed some TLC and then crossed a threshold that it was more than that. And so the congregation decided to join another United Methodist congregation and gave the building and the block to Simpson Housing, which is now has been for quite some time, a separate organization. And because the building is beyond repair, they have just recently got the permit to tear it down, and they have a plan and they have funding to be able to reconstruct some community space, some new shelter space that's designed to be a shelter. So there's some really unique features and attributes that they're working on to keep the dignity lifted rather than just accommodate in an open space in a church. And then also there'll be some transitional apartments on the top floors of that block. So I don't know exactly groundbreaking, and I don't know exactly the length of construction, but I do know they too have had a lot of shareholders and stakeholders to help realize the vision of being able to provide that. So they're going that way. So temporarily they've relocated their shelter, so they're still going strong with the shelter in a separate setting. And their offices have moved, and their office space is now over at Glenwood to administer over all their housing programs and outreach programs and stuff. So, yeah. Yeah.
What did they do with the people from Calvary?
That I'm not sure. I mean, from the building by us, from Exodus. Yeah, they moved. Actually, the nursing home itself, I guess, was really shrinking in number. And they then when they decided to actually move to sell it, they found other places for the residents in other care centers along the way. Yeah, no, they were real, as I understand it, real clear that no one was going to be left out until they got everyone situated in a new place. And yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks. Yes. Oh, sure. Yep. Yeah. So Align Minneapolis is another collaboration that used to be called Downtown Congregations to End Homelessness. So that may be familiar to a few folks as well. It was a collaboration of a number of different faith communities, and what the kind of convening core value was ending homelessness. And most were right in the heart of the city. And so it was a few years ago that we changed to Align, the name to Align Minneapolis. But as a collaboration, there are a number of efforts that are done. About 6 of us do direct service, like I just described. So we provide direct services to folks that need them. Others are involved in some of our advocacy work. Others have some other kinds of outreach work that they do and just care enough about ending homelessness that they've also joined the collaboration. We also have a program called Street Voices for Change, which supports the organizing of folks who have lived experience of homelessness to organize, to determine issues of importance to their lives, and to help organize and advocate on those issues. And so there's 2 groups of folks that meet weekly, and there's also a leadership council of folks. Many are currently experiencing homelessness, others recently have or formerly have, and it's that bringing the voice of that lived experience to the wider arena and the wider community to advocate for change and issues that really matter in those lives. You know, there's a lot of policymakers and other do-gooders that, like myself, that sometimes think we know what's right or what's best. And we can know a lot of things in that regard, but if it hasn't been our lived experience, there's a piece of the equation that's really important to be able to include. And so that's part of what Street Voices for Change does. So the collaboration supports that. Okay, great. Thank you.
Now I'll introduce Chris. Carol and I were able to sit down with Chris, I suppose that was a month and a half ago, 2 months ago?
Months ago, yeah.
Yeah, and we were just so impressed by all of the information he had for us and truly how things are in flux with some budgets. As we heard, there's just sometimes green TLC that needs to go into these projects. And yeah, I really appreciate your ability to integrate that reality with just a heart of compassion. So yeah, we're so lucky to hear from Chris, and thank you, Michael. There will be, like Carol said, if you didn't hear her, a question and answer time for both of these speakers after. So if you have a burning question, there will be time. Thank you.
There will be time, or if you have a burning urgency to catch the end of the Vikings game too, we won't be offended if that's how you transition your afternoon. It's a bold move to counter-program an important event like this against a Vikings game. So it means all the more to have folks in the room. I see some Viking jerseys here. I know Jeff is especially itching. Is it still 7-0, Jeff? All right, good. 7-0. We're up. Well, good afternoon, Calvary and others from other parts of our community. And I know we're recording this. If folks are listening to this later, just want to thank Calvary Faith and Justice, Carol, for your leadership on this. I know we have a couple of other congregations. I don't know if you're represented here today or not, or you'll be listening later, but I just want to recognize Greater Friendship Baptist, Macedonia Baptist is a part of the collaborative of congregations that have been involved in these congregations. Both, by the way, Beacon congregations. I'll say a little bit more about Beacon in a minute in my background. But so I really want to ground us today in sort of a 30,000 foot level perspective of what's happening on this intersecting crisis of homelessness and affordable housing. I think it's fair to call it crisis in the state of Minnesota. And hopefully to help each of us sitting here today find our place in that story, to come out of here today with maybe a greater, more awakened imagination, and maybe even a bias towards action that could have us all be a part of that story. Where I kind of want to start is to ask, who in this room has personally had, either in the past or now, a lived experience of experiencing homelessness, being underhoused, housing instability, either in the past or currently? Just show of hands. So we have that lived experience represented in the room. Who has close friends, family members, or loved ones who in the past or currently are underhoused, experiencing housing instability or homelessness? Show of hands. More hands, about half the folks in this room. And if we widen the aperture beyond this church basement right here, just to our friends and neighbors, that is the experience of being a resident, a community member, a neighbor in Minnesota right now, perhaps more so than at any other time in our history. And that's where I want to ground us today. Because we all have a place in the story, whether it's a part of our lived experience now or in the past. It's our friends and loved ones, or question as old as time, perhaps the oldest question: am I my brother's keeper? That question grounds all of our place in the story. My name is Chris Latondras. I'm a Calvary member. My wife Ashley has been a Calvary member much longer. Do you want to wave, Ashley? And so we find ourselves here. A little bit of my background. You're catching me here on week 3 of a pretty significant professional transition. About 3 weeks ago, I joined an organization called Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative as their CEO. Kate Tabor here is one of our congregational organizers. If you want to wave, Kate, we've got some materials on the table. Beacon is the largest developer of deeply affordable and supportive housing in the state of Minnesota. I'll say a little bit more about what that means. We've heard a few, Michael did a really great job of talking about the housing continuum of affordability, from workforce housing all the way down to housing that facilitates exits from homelessness directly. That's really where Beacon sits when we talk about deep affordability. We're talking about households at 30% of the area median income and below. And when we talk about supportive housing, we're talking about embedding services. We always partner with a service provider depending on the target population of a building to make sure that those residents are well supported in the places that they live. We currently have a portfolio that includes just under 700 units across 19 properties. We have pretty robust and ambitious plans for growth in the decade ahead, about 2 new multifamily buildings of anywhere from 50 to 70 units a year for the next 10 years, which is pretty robust. And while we're in the midst of that, also trying to figure out how we hold what we have. This transition, though, I most recently, just a few weeks ago, stepped down from my role as a Hennepin County Commissioner representing the 6th District. Does anybody here would say you know a lot about what the county does? Raise your hand if you're well familiar with Hennepin County. Not many, a little bit. Hennepin County is sort of this, when we're talking about Hennepin County, we're talking about, or county government, we're talking about local government. So federal government, what happens in DC, state government, what happens in St. Paul, local government closest to the people, all of us. We're talking about city government, city councils. We're talking about school districts and school boards. We're talking about in this case, the Hennepin County Board of Commissioners. Hennepin County, Minnesota's second largest government in the state, second only to the state, oversees about a $2.6 billion annual budget that intersects with every imaginable topic, including homelessness and housing stability and affordable housing. I tell people I did not have stepping down from my elected role on my 2023 bingo card. I loved being a Hennepin County Commissioner. Actually, the issue that propelled me into that work to begin with, I was sitting on the Hopkins School Board, really observed right there in our school district data for any of you that are involved in education, the role of housing stability in student success and student achievement. In our data, it showed that the single greatest predictor of closing what has often been described as racial achievement gaps or opportunity gaps was how often or how long a student stayed in our district. If a student stayed in Hopkins Public Schools for more than 5 years, regardless of their economic background, regardless of their racial background, more than any other thing we did, if they could stay with us for 5 years, it could close those gaps. Well, that's a housing stability question. That's not something that I had a lever on the school board to do anything about. But so many of the challenges facing our students and families were really challenges of income and healthcare and mental health and housing stability. And that's what motivated me to run for commissioner. Now, in that work, I really threw myself into housing as sort of the preeminent topic I was dealing with at a pretty extraordinary time for Hennepin County and Hennepin County government. We were all in the middle of a pandemic. Local governments were receiving a lot of new federal dollars to, both address emergency needs, but also think towards the future. Housing was the single biggest investment area that we directed those dollars to. But it's against the backdrop, and I think this is where I sort of want to take us as briefly as I can today through, to root us in the realities of the challenge, to talk about the opportunity in front of us as Minnesotans and anybody who wants to find themselves in that story. And then number 3, to talk about the call, like what might we do about it as any of us sitting here today who care about this issue. So, first to ground us in the facts, just in Hennepin County, and you can extrapolate this to the 7-county metro area, 1 in 3 households in Hennepin County are housing cost burdened. That means that they spend more than a third of their income on their rent or their mortgage. Now, you can be in $1 million home and be housing cost burdened, so that represents the whole continuum. But 1 in 3 families are households are housing cost burdened. We have seen this magnified and exacerbated through the pandemic. Any of you that were in housing, or maybe you're a landlord, there was this thing called the federal eviction moratorium that said that property owners could not evict tenants. That was matched with unprecedented federal relief, dollars that could be paid to landlords to be made, if not whole, at least to help stabilize residents in their home. That was really important through the middle of the pandemic. In fact, we saw in Hennepin County on just family homelessness a reduction from, when we talk about our family shelter system in Hennepin County, we always have some slack in that system because we have a shelter all policy in Hennepin County. It basically means if a parent with a child calls our hotline and needs a place to sleep tonight, we are required to find a place for them to sleep. That's not necessarily true for single adults. That's a much bigger policy topic. But for families, we have that requirement. So we always operated with some slack. Meant that our family shelter system operated pre-pandemic at about 80%. Through the pandemic, and this is sort of a paradox, but because of the eviction moratorium and those federal dollars, we actually saw family homelessness go down to 20% of capacity. It shouldn't be a surprise if you give families what they need to stay in their homes, they don't experience homelessness. That eviction moratorium last summer, so 2022, was lifted. Those emergency rental assistance dollars went away, and what we've seen on the other side of that is that the impacts of this pandemic are still with us and worse than they've ever been before. We have now seen, as we sit here today on family homelessness, a surge. We've gone from 80 to 20%. We're now at 350% on family homelessness. We've never seen that before. It is a hair on fire emergency. How many of your friends and neighbors are talking about that or even aware that we have an emergency in family homelessness? We know it here. You don't have to look far to understand why we're seeing that crisis in Hennepin County. And again, this is in Hennepin County alone, but you can extrapolate that further. There are roughly 75,000 extremely low-income households in Hennepin County. That's at that 30% of the area, median income and below. There's less than 14,000 units of housing available that would be affordable to a household at that level. 75,000, 14,000. That represents a 50,000 unit gap that directly corresponds to this surge that we're seeing. So we're in a church basement right now, appropriate to bring a little public theology into this. Our Bibles say in Matthew, it says, I tell you the truth, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move what? Mountains. This is a mountain of a challenge, that 50,000 unit gap. That 300% surge in family homelessness is a mountain of a challenge. And where I'm about to go with this, the political opportunity and challenge, and I don't mean in terms of left-right politics, I mean in terms of the political will needed to address that gap. That is a mountain of a challenge as well. And that's where I hope I can help inspire folks today to find themselves in that story so we can move mountains together. So that's the challenge. I want to just share briefly a story. My two boys were sitting in here earlier. I think each of them had 2 chocolate chip cookies. So they're wound up like the Energizer Bunny right now, running around here somewhere. So my now 5-year-old, he was 4 at the time, this is a few weeks ago, we had a Father-Son Day before school. School hadn't started for him, so we had to figure out what to do. And we live in Hopkins. Hopkins has got a great little downtown. So I had a father-son morning with Hugo in Hopkins. And we went to Hoagie's, Little Greasy Spoon. We went down the street to Bud's Music Center where he found some bongos to bang on. Then we went to the other end of Main Street to Kitty Wampus, a kid's store. And I realized, holy smokes, just 1 block from here, there's a beacon project going up. We just broke ground on it this spring. It's 50 units. It's called Vista 44, 50 units of housing for deeply affordable and supportive housing for families. And I thought, well, this would be fun to show Hugo, Dad's about to make this transition, give him a little idea of what I'm going to be up to. So we went down there, and of course that's exciting for a 4-year-old. It's exciting for a 41-year-old in this case, seeing, the backhoes and the guys in their construction equipment and, a building literally springing up out of what was a Catholic church parking lot there in Hopkins. And so we, was looking at the backhoes and the buildings going up and said, well, Hugo, this is what your dad's going to be doing. We're going to be building housing here for families. That's moms and dads with kids that don't have a place to live right now. And so he was, taking that all in. As we were walking away from there, I assumed his mind had moved on to other things. But he stopped me and he said, Dad, I have a question. I said, well, what, buddy? And he said, where are those little kids and their moms and dads sleeping now? And it just took my breath away, still takes my breath away, because that right there is the question. That is the, am I my brother's keeper question. That's about awakening. If a 4-year-old can understand and have that critical consciousness awoken in them to understand the magnitude of a problem like this, why can't we grown-ups figure it out? And that's the distance that we need to figure out how to close together. The opportunity. So another way to frame this would be to say, how might we scale to move mountains of housing instability in Minnesota? And I say this as a now recovering policymaker. How I answered that question before coming to Beacon, and I still think it's true, is it's really three things. I think of it as like a 3-legged stool. So number one, how do we scale to meet the moment? It's about dramatically scaling up the public resources, public dollars needed in order to build this kind of housing. Because I'll say affordability at any level does not have, the market does not create this housing, full stop. Any affordability, whether it's workforce all the way down to extremely low income, happens because some public funder is filling that gap between what the market will support and paying the remainder of the rent to build the building, to build that capital stack. Michael, you were talking about all these little, buckets filling bigger buckets in order to make the capital side of these projects go. I mean, for any project we're building, we have to haul down federal tax credits. We got to bring in state dollars. We've got to go to Hennepin County or the city of Minneapolis. And even then, we barely get the dollars together to get it done. That's a political will question. That's are our policymakers prioritizing housing question. In this country, we don't. The primary vehicle we have to keep people stably housed, Section 8 vouchers, it's a federal program. That program is oversubscribed 4-to-1. For every eligible 4 families or households or individuals that would income qualify for one of those vouchers, there's only one voucher available. That right there is one way of quantifying the whole problem. So we need to dramatically scale public resources. Good news is the state of Minnesota this past year passed a historic amount of money, $1 billion over 2 years to address that need. It's about 4 times larger than the state has ever done before, and it will help. They also passed a sales tax, a metro area sales tax, 1/4 cent on anything you buy will generate in our area about $200 million a year. It's the first time in Minnesota history. It actually, most states just don't have this period, so we're ahead of the curve here. $200 million a year in permanent revenues, year after year after year, for affordable housing. 1/4 of those dollars are going to create the state's first ever version of sort of a Section 8 program. Half of those dollars are going to counties. So I'll say, as a former commissioner, whatever county you live in, you better be asking your policymakers what they intend to do with those dollars. That's really important. And then 1/4 of them are going to cities. So again, similarly, whatever city you go into, you better be asking your policymakers what their plans are for that 1/4 cent sales tax revenues. So we've got to scale the public resources. Secondly, for the most part, government doesn't build this housing. This housing happens because of, the St. Olafs of the world, or the Simpson Housings of the world, or the Beacons of the world, Project for Pride and Living, Aon, I mean, there's Common Bond. There's an ecosystem of mission-driven nonprofit housing developers that build this housing through these public dollars. So we need to really strengthen our system of mission-driven nonprofit housing developers. And I'll say right now, that industry in and of itself, Beacon included, is sort of on life support. We've been charged by policymakers who want to address homelessness and affordability with building the infrastructure in order to hold that. And I'll say we're barely holding it. So that's where we need to go to policymakers, especially with $1 billion new in the system, and say, what are you doing to not just say we need to scale more housing, but to make sure that those that actually hold this housing and hold these residents are able to make that work. So scaling public resources, strengthening our ecosystem of mission-driven housing developers. And the third piece is, I think, where all of us come in. It's on building the political will necessary to get this done. Here's what I mean by that. Number one, at a hyper-local level, anytime a developer like Beacon comes into a community or a neighborhood to build housing like this, let's just say neighbors usually have a point of view on whether or not they want a project like this coming into their neighborhood. If folks have heard the expression NIMBY or NIMBYism, not in my backyard, oftentimes that political fight, and I hate to call it a fight, but it feels like a fight sometimes, is as big of a challenge as just pulling together the capital dollars needed to build the project in the first place. You can have all the funding in line, you can have the site picked out, and it can die on a 3-2 city council vote or a 4-3 city council vote because so many neighbors come up and say, well, we don't want that here. And so that's the political will building on the other side of that, and that's some of what Beacon does, is to say, well, no, like, how do we build a coalition of conscience that's willing to step into these spaces and say, we are here prepared to welcome, we need this housing in our community, and we are prepared to welcome these new neighbors as our own flesh and blood into this community. We just, Beacon is in the process right now of, we want to build a 40-some unit building in Richfield. Target population for this project is neurodivergent adults exiting homelessness or at risk of homelessness. So we just had our rezoning meeting at the city of Richfield this past Monday, and 3 predictably very agitated, upset neighbors came to speak against that project, using all of the language that I think would make anyone in this room blush about othering people and, well, we can't have those people here, and what's that going to do to our property values. And the other side of the story was there were 50 blue shirts in that room of Beacon interfaith housing advocacy advocates who were there to say, no, we need this here and we want this here. I can say as a former policymaker, I used to tell people I lived and worked in Washington, D.C. for a while, and we'd organize like advocacy visits to Capitol Hill, and we'd tell our advocates, as they were getting ready to go up on Capitol Hill, we know you're only in D.C. for one day. We don't want you to waste your time. So we want to make it really easy for you to identify who the Congress people are. So as you go up there, look for people that have their fingers up in the air, and then they lick their finger to see which way the wind is blowing. That's how you know a politician. And I'll say even those that are aligned with our priorities and values, I mean, they're reading the room. They got to decide if they're going to be, if they want to take a stand or live to fight another day. And so this political will building is so important. The second piece of that is, so Beacon has organized a collaborative of 100 congregations around the metro area. I know Greater Friendship Baptist, Macedonia Baptist are a part of that. I don't know our whole collaborative. I would imagine St. Olaf is probably, we'll find out. I know St. Olaf's is just an extraordinary leadership in this space as a co-belligerent. But this past session, we've taken that political will that started with communities and individual projects to St. Paul for a campaign this past session called Bring It Home Minnesota, to create that first, there's some materials on your table, to create that first ever housing voucher program in Minnesota history. So that's the political will building. So that's really, I mean, just to conclude here, that's really the call to action, to root us back in that text. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. That 300% surge in homelessness is a mountain. That 50,000 unit gap is a mountain. Sometimes a mountain looks like trying to persuade a council where you've got 3 votes, but how are you going to get that critical 4th vote? That can be a mountain. And how we move those mountains is through the faith the size of a mustard seed, individuals who are willing to step forward in faith, to believe in home, and to stand up and say, this is what we need in our community. So that's the story I hope folks can find themselves in, whether it's with Beacon or any other of the incredible organizations in our community that are making this happen. I just want to thank especially Calvary for being a place where we can have this conversation. So, yep. Yeah. Do we have time for a few questions? I don't know where we're at. Yeah, Mike? Do you want to come back up, Michael, and we can field some questions together? Yeah, go ahead. On the rent control topic? Yeah, I know that's enough. So I'm just going to try to repeat the question for the purposes of the recording. We had a question here about how do policymakers and our policymakers going to make decisions around our rent increases and whether rent goes up. I mean, that's a major policy topic. I think what you're talking about is, there's a big debate around rent control, and that's something that folks have mobilized around. I know in St. Paul they passed it. I think then they pulled it back. There's a conversation happening here in Minneapolis around that right now. But I just want to elevate it as the connection between policy and how that impacts real people is really palatable, especially in this housing discussion. I don't know where that's going to go in Minneapolis, but yeah. You, come join me up here. Other questions? Yeah, Jeff.
Just another point of information. Across the street is the Common Bond building, adding on Common Bond. So the old former Minneapolis school right across the street, they're now adding to that. So there's going to be more housing.
Yep.
So this is a crazy idea, but it's, you just mentioned Richfield, right? We're trying to build a 40-unit building.
Yeah, I think it's around 45 units. Yep.
What if 40 churches put an apartment for transitional families in their church? You don't build anything. The congregation builds an apartment. We've basically done that here for 30-some years. It's just one. But if 40 churches did that in Richfield, you would have the goodwill of the neighborhood, right? And that's what Christians used to be known for.
Yeah.
And, neighbors thought of them highly instead of how they think of it sometimes now. And I know that there's a lot of needs beyond the housing for a lot of people, right? So I'm not talking about the most vulnerable or those with the most mental health, addiction, whatever. I'm just talking about transitional housing.
You mean specifically? Yeah.
40 churches. We can't get 40 churches in Richmond to say we'll put an apartment in our building.
And you mean specifically like a one unit? Yep. Yeah. I mean, Jeff, it's a really, I think the heart behind that idea is correct. I mean, Beacon for a long time partnered with and as a part of our work was this program called Families Moving Forward, which was a version of precisely that. We actually, for a variety of reasons, wound that down, in part because, particularly when we're talking about single adult homelessness, so often with this population, there are so many extraordinary and complex needs that what we've found is in order to actually ensure folks are supported and have the services they need, it's very challenging to do it in the distributing. But as a not alternative to that, but an example of that, like in Hopkins, now we had to purchase the property in this case from the Catholic Church, but we're building a 50-unit building on a Catholic Church parking lot. As you were mentioning earlier, in some of our suburban contexts, there's a lot more acres and miles of green space and asphalt that could be, for a congregation that was really mission driven and wanted to say, well, rather than having a organization like Beacon having to purchase that, we just want that to become a love offering, or maybe there's some other congregations that help support them in that. I mean, that's another version of that vision. But I think that the sentiment about what does it take for congregations to really come together, not only around the advocacy side of this, but around really holding people is worthy.
Congregations have so many resources within them.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, just look at the people in this room. They're just a small fraction of the resources here at Calvary. So I always think of people, housing is also like this place. We talk about that places involve people, not just the room.
Yeah.
So that relational element of addressing the need seems to be something that we got creative somehow to be a part of that.
Absolutely. Well, this is a great place to start this conversation right here. Other questions, or did you have any thoughts on that?
Just one thought with congregation life, because like I said, I started working part-time in high school for a congregation, and I pretty quickly discovered, answering the phone in the evenings, if I had 10 calls from members of the community or those outside, I probably had 20 to 25 different opinions about what was going on and what was needed.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's foundational to congregation life. Everyone has more than one opinion. And while, across the spectrum of congregations in the Twin Cities, some have more maybe a shared vision for around this issue, but not every congregation does. Within my own congregation of St. Olaf, we have a spectrum of folks on a lot of different issues. And so I think one of the things, though, that we can do, especially on something like this, is make sure we're talking to each other. Make sure we're bringing each other along around this. And when there's difference, we don't water down the vision, but we do the work to be able to bring some others along. And I think that happens in congregation life. I think it happens in political life. I think it happens among elected officials. Sometimes a group in power will get something passed, but there's a whole other half minus one that didn't get what they were looking for, that are really ticked off, deeply ticked off. And that's not a way to build community, even if you advance your particular goal. And so I think one of the gifts that we can be as communities of faith is remind each other of what we're founded on. Remind each other of those important practices of loving our neighbor as ourselves, and being able to put some of that into practice in order to bring the whole community along. That will be critical to our ability to meet the needs of our sisters and brothers who are most deeply in need, and often suffer by that indifference or that animosity that we have for each other.
Yeah, Lynn. Yeah, our patch, at least right now, has primarily been focused on new developments where we're able to build from the ground up, both the bricks and mortar, but also with the service, like building to suit for a particular population with a particular service provider. Sorry to repeat the question. Lynn asked a question about NOAA, or it stands for Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing. So there's a real need in our community. There's a lot of housing in our community, older housing stock that right now, just because of where the rents are at, is might not be at that level of deep affordability, 30% and AMI and below, but might be affordable to somebody on 60% of the area median income. And a lot of times what happens though is these buildings get purchased by an investor, and then they improve, significantly improve the units and then jack up the rents, and suddenly what was naturally occurring affordable housing gets taken offline. And so there's public strategies around that, financing policies around that kind of NOAA acquisition and rehab. One of our partner organizations in the ecosystem, Aon in particular, has been really focused on that work. But that hasn't been specifically Beacon's patch, but a really critical part of the ecosystem. Yeah, maybe time for one more question. Then I also want to give, I'm going to have Kate Tabor with Beacon to share briefly about how congregations can get involved with Beacon's work, but go ahead.
I ran into a couple sleeping in the back of my building, and I was telling them about the different shelters that was open. So the thing was, the man said we can go in, but we can't go in as a couple, like because we're not married. So I was almost up something for people that are family with kids, but they're not married to each other.
Yeah, that's
A lot of that's going on.
a great question, and I have to confess, as a relative newcomer to my organization, I don't entirely know how we parse that out. We have some properties that are specifically for single adults. We have properties that are family. I don't know how that gets parsed, so I can look into it. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
And they're just out here wandering around, and some of them with the children.
Yep. Yeah, chosen family and different types of families. Yep. Absolutely. Notes. Thank you. Well, good. Well, I know we're at the end of our time or close to it. Kate, do you want to just introduce yourself and say a few words about our congregational collaborative?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, I'm Kate Tabor. I'm a Presbyterian minister by training, and I've served in congregational settings in ministry. I've served overseas as a mission partner in Israel and Palestine for the Presbyterian Church. I've served as a university chaplain. But what brought me to work at the intersection of housing and development and policy is because housing is really foundational to the experience and thriving of every population I've ever cared about, from refugees to young adults. It affects everyone, right? It affects everyone in our communities. And what's been so inspiring to me about working for Beacon is exactly what, was it the senior pastor here was saying?
Oh, yeah, Jeff.
That we have the potential as communities of faith to do more together than we do individually. And we are hubs of incredible resources, people, money, space, time, influence. We have moral influence in our society. And the ways that congregations get involved with Beacon are through a myriad of ways, from volunteering to fundraising to advocacy to organizing. Congregants come together and influence our building developments. This was a great example about the land use rezoning for the development in Richfield. We bring people together who have moral clarity about the need to meet this housing crisis. But we also, in our experience as building developers, have noticed that building 40 to 50 unit buildings once or twice a year is not going to meet that 50,000 unit gap, right? We have to do more. We will keep building, but we need policies to change. We need more help being given to families that are at risk of homelessness. And so we've gotten more and more involved in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 years in doing policy advocacy. So the Bring It Home state voucher program was mentioned. Beacon was the lead on that campaign. And we started what we're calling the first version of Bring It Home because what passed was a small version of our large vision to really close that 1 in 4 gap you heard. 1 in 4 households who need rental vouchers currently get them. We want 4 in 4 households who need rental vouchers to get them. This program is going to mean that over 5,000 more households will get rental vouchers than would have without this program. So it's an amazing first step. It's going to make a huge difference in the lives of thousands of Minnesotans. And part of the ways that congregations have been involved is showing up in advocacy for that campaign. There's also a Minneapolis-focused campaign. I'm the Minneapolis congregational organizer, and we've been celebrating a huge win in the Minneapolis ecosystem to increase the amount of money that's in the line item, a budget line item called the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in Minneapolis. It had been decreased dramatically over several years. We've been advocating for that money to go up and for the funding to be directed to investing in those units that are for people coming out of homelessness, for people at 30% of the area median income or lower. Previously, there was no specific language about what kind of affordability that funding should go towards. And as of this past spring, after multiple years of telling us we had no business to be advocating about how they spent the money, they now say they agree with us, and agreed with us the whole time, that this money should really go to those who need it the most. So the program goals have changed for this line item program in the Minneapolis city budget, and we're waiting this year to see if they're actually going to change how they allocate their funding based on what they say their priorities are. So all this to say, these are some examples of the ways that congregations have really shown up in leadership for advocacy, both for our building campaigns and policy campaigns. We're also finding more and more ways for congregations to support the actual residents in our buildings. There are, residents moving in all the time that need household goods. You've mentioned this. There are opportunities to come alongside residents in our buildings and engage in things like gardening and landscaping the building, or filling a clothing and household goods closet that the building has. So we have lots of different ways for congregations to get involved in leadership. We partner a lot with Align. I work a lot with Katie Dillon. Align is Minneapolis focused, and Beacon has this sort of broader mandate, but serves a similar function. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. So I think we'll leave it there for now. We'll be sticking around for a little bit after. I know if you are looking specifically to get more involved, for sure leave your name and email address on the paper going around. We'll collect those, and Carol will give you the last word here. Thank you so much.
Well, Contessa's with me. We want to recognize Dr. Charvez Russell for coming from Greater Friendship Missionary Baptist. He's one of our Southside Coalition partners. And Contessa and I and all of Faith and Justice Committee, thank you. It's very important that you sign up to get your phone, your name, and your email, because as things come up, we are stronger together. We build community. One simple phone call. If you have time to show up for a city council meeting, if you have time for a neighborhood association, even once a year, if we tell you that that's going on, that can really help. So I thank you for coming. I'll turn it over to Contessa.
The only thing left to do is thank Carol. Thank you for all of your work and dedication organizing this event. It was amazing.
Well, thank you. It's on my heart. I feel like I've told people when I've been going through it in the last 6 months that I think this has been my greatest journey as a Christian, because we truly need to care about every person having a place to lay their head at night and feel safe, have a place to cook their meals, have a place to be warm in the winter and just protected in the summer. I'm not going to say totally cool because not everybody can afford air conditioning, but so that's how I've gotten involved, and they're here to answer any of your questions. And like I said, it's extremely important to do the sign-up sheets. If you can't find one, we'll bring one around, because that's the way you can stay involved with us. Thank you.